Hello, folks, and welcome to another SpaceWave discussion, and one that I think is going to be particularly important when we consider what the next few years of human spaceflight may or may not hold. I'm Jack Daleo, reporting on spaceflight for Flying Magazine, and I'm joined today by Casey Dreier, who is the Chief of Space Policy for the Planetary Society, to talk about NASA's Artemis program. Casey, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, and we're going to be talking about Artemis, which is this NASA's program to land the first Americans on the moon since the Apollo era. But first, Casey, can you just tell us a little bit about the Planetary Society and what you do there?
Planetary Society is a nonprofit. It's an independent organization, and it's not made up exclusively of scientists or engineers or any other kind of aerospace interests. It's meant for anyone. And we primarily, our membership is just members of the public in the United States and abroad. We were founded by Carl Sagan back in 1980, so we've been around for 45 years. And that independence, right, that we don't take corporate aerospace money, we don't depend on government contracts. That independence means we like to reflect what we believe as these values and interests of people who share these desires to not just explore space, but to use science and exploration and find that joy and excitement of just pushing further out there. And so the organization is kind of centered around that. I run our advocacy and policy program. So that's one of the things that we do, is help to organize our members to engage in the political process, to speak up for space science and exploration, and also to write and analyze and provide the context, to make better decisions about where we go and why.
Right. So a collection of people who are very passionate about space and who are helping to guide the industry in the right direction. And I know that Artemis is something that the Planetary Society is, tracking very closely. I explained it a little bit at the top of the session here. It's essentially the successor to the Apollo program. There's already been one Artemis flight. It was an uncrewed mission back in 2022. There are two more that NASA is gearing up for. Artemis 2, which would be a crewed trip around the moon and back, and then Artemis 3, which is the lunar landing scheduled for mid-2027. From the Planetary Society's perspective, what is the importance of Artemis? Why does it matter? And what is NASA hoping to get out of this?
There's a couple of ways to think about it, but I think the key aspect is that, unlike Apollo, Artemis is not designed to just land and come back and that's it. Artemis, the whole idea of Artemis is that we're going to the moon to stay. Now, that's not just rhetoric. That actually has some very important implications in terms of not just how our international partners want to engage in this project, but how commercial and other economic partners want to engage. So the idea is that if the US is going to maintain some sort of a permanent presence at or around the moon, then these companies, this large tent has formed around saying, other nations who want to invest themselves, other companies who want to be a part and create this efforts of a cislunar, they call it a lunar economy, that their business models aren't in a sense taking in the risk of that the US decides to leave, that we don't abandon this. And that allows for people to say, we're going to maybe lose money now, but because there's going to be an ongoing presence at the moon, there will be a permanent new marketplace to engage in. For international partners and allies, it takes a while to spin up their political systems, but we want to be allied with the United States and what it's doing in space. We will be ongoing allies, the way that we've been with the International Space Station for nearly 30 years. So that key that we're going back to stay, that unlocks this larger aspect of a community partnerships, both with economic partners and international partners, that really changed the game in terms of what the United States is doing. So Artemis, and its, I think, idealized concept, it's extending US and national values. It's inviting people who share those values, private or international, to do those with us. And it enables us to then push further out and really, for the first time in our human history, consider ourselves, if not a multi-planet species, a beyond Earth species that is not just going for little camping trips, but settling, in terms of a longer stay for some of these very harsh places.
Yeah, it's an important distinction to make. And as you mentioned, it's a public-private partnership. NASA is building some of the components. They're outsourcing others to private contractors like SpaceX and Blue Origin and Boeing, and also an international effort. We have the Artemis Accords, which many countries have signed on to. I believe we're
Over
at
50
about 50.
nations.
Yeah, about over 50 now. And I don't. But before we get into the finer details of Artemis, I think it's important to talk about what exactly is happening at NASA right now. Casey and I, we actually discussed this about a month ago. What the incoming presidential administration, the effect that they might have on Artemis. And we're recording again because so much has happened since President Donald Trump and his administration took office. So let's talk about kind of the shakeup that's happening right now at NASA, and maybe we can start from some of the early actions that Trump and his administration took. For example, Janet Petro, who previously was the director of Kennedy Space Center, was named acting administrator, which some people in the industry came as a surprise to, because normally that role would be filled by the associate administrator, Jim Free. And Jim Free is very heavily involved with NASA's Moon to Mars effort. He was a key architect behind the Artemis program, and he resigned over the weekend. What do you make of these leadership changes that we're already seeing at NASA?
I mean, I think it was a surprise, not just to industry folks, but pretty much everyone. I believe it's the first time that, so a new administration comes in, the last administration's NASA leadership resigns. That's standard. The change in this case, you're right, is that it's normally goes to the associate administrator. He's the top civil servant. He's been there. The idea is there's continuity that keep the agency running until the new leadership is confirmed by the Senate. Jumping over him to the director of Kennedy Space Center, I guess, is unprecedented. It's still, frankly, not clear why that decision was made or who made that decision. And clearly, Jim Free, at some level, elected or was suggested to retire. And again, that is still actually not clear why that is. So I'm hesitant to speculate. But we can say that it is not historically the case that this has happened. There's been a number of other, maybe let's step back and say there's a lot of things that's happening at NASA, but there's nothing that has been specifically targeted at NASA so far, right? So President Trump obviously has been issuing a lot of executive orders. Some of them are rather sweeping. Some of them are being challenged in court, but these are generally full government executive orders. NASA, being part of the executive branch, has to comply, and they're doing so in a way, that's, I think, tumultuous for those who are going through it potentially. But at the same time, I think there's nothing targeted at the agency specifically. These are the consequence, in the sense of these broad policy changes that's happening within the executive branch right now.
Right. NASA has kind of been caught up in the more sweeping actions of the presidency. And one of those actions is trimming the federal workforce. We've already seen some attempts to do that at NASA. Just a few examples. We had a hiring freeze that was implemented very early on after Trump took office. Deferred resignation offer was something that the Trump administration offered to federal workers. NASA has said that several hundred employees took that offer and will be leaving. We have a directive for NASA employees to return to office. Just this past week, we had attempts by the Trump administration to fire about 1,000 probationary workers at NASA. That was ultimately reversed, but there's still a chance that could happen. And over the weekend, we had this email from the Office of Personnel Management asking NASA employees and all federal employees to basically say what they do in the past week. So you have all of these efforts to kind of trim the workforce. What kind of impact could that have on a program like Artemis, where you have so many folks across NASA facilities working on it?
It's probably not good in the way that they're doing it. So I think this is the other important thing to make the distinction, is that we're at this point talking about civil servants, of which NASA has about, let's say, 18,000 total civil servants, full and part-time. Now, is that the right number? It's hard to say, because we don't have yet a strategy and any sort of different or new strategy set out by the new administration in terms of what they want NASA to do or not do. NASA's civil service over its history has been as high as 36,000 at the peak of the Apollo program, and right now is actually about as low as it's ever been, 18 to 17,000 employees. NASA hasn't had those levels since basically 1962 when it was ramping up to Apollo, right after it was created. The 90s was an era where NASA cut about a third of its workforce, went from about 25,000 down to 19. And that era was, so, I mean, the idea that we should, reduce the size of the civil service workforce, that's not necessarily unusual. It's not an impossible thing to do. And I think the people like the Planetary Society who have been concerned about some of these actions, it's not that we're saying we need civil servants because that's the absolute best thing. We just need more of them. It's how they're doing it. And I think that's the key to your question. The layoffs that so again, we should emphasize NASA at the last minute was spared this firing of probationary employees. That's basically anyone who was hired in the last year or promoted, or particularly coming from other agencies in the last year. There's no strategy there. It's just because those individuals are easier to fire based on the probationary period that most of us, when we get hired to a job, we're under some kind of probationary period until, a few months or a year goes by. But it didn't have anything to do with what skills do these people have? What are they bringing to the agency? What do we need going forward? What type of performance are they doing? And they would overwhelmingly be younger career, early career individuals, the future leaders of the organization getting started. So the indiscriminate nature of cutting the civil service workforce, that's not going to help, I don't think, any of the goals that NASA has coming forward to make them better. And if anyone has tried to say how indiscriminate cuts of NASA's workforce will help the agency achieve its goals, I have yet to see it being made. So thankfully, the worst of that was spared. Those taking the deferred resignation program, that's again somewhat indiscriminate. We don't know exactly who those individuals are. Probably a lot of them are planning to retire. And any given year, NASA loses about 1,000 or so employees to retirement and just taking other jobs. They're hiring at the same time, so their overall workforce stays about the same. This obviously they're not hiring. I think they're maybe not be under a hiring freeze, but they have to hire. They can only hire one person for every 4 people who leave the agency, so it's functionally a hiring freeze at this point. So the idea is, I think that you're losing people regardless of what they're providing or what you need as an agency, and that to us is the concern. So again, NASA was spared the worst of it. The deferred resignation, again, they did a similar process back in the 90s. They encouraged people to leave by offering them bonuses to depart, and that helps you reduce your overall head count. So it's not necessarily great where we are, but it could have been a lot worse for NASA.
Right. So we're seeing techs that have been used in the past to maybe
broadly,
identify
just
waste.
not as fast. I think that's the other key thing. So the 90s, when they reduced NASA's workforce again by about a little less than a third, they did that over the course of 5 years. Right. So that overall reduction was a year-to-year step down. And they went to, at the time, Congress authorized an overall strategy to reduce the size of the civil service. Congress authorized funds to pay out as an incentive for people to retire or leave the agencies early. And there's frankly debate about whether encouraging people to depart and paying them money to do so will actually just drain the people who have the most, capability to go and work. So you may be losing some of your best people, or people who would have retired anyway. But again, this is the speed is also, I think, the aspect of that. So if NASA had gone through with that probationary cut last week and lost 1,000 people in a day, that would have been NASA's largest single layoff in its history, and it would have been in its annualized, assuming there wasn't any other layoffs, would have been its largest involuntary layoff since the end of the Apollo program. And I think that's also the key here, right? It's like when NASA shrunk after Apollo, they had finished landing on the moon. They had gone to the moon and finished the program. Now we're doing the opposite. We're trying to spin up a program. We're trying to go to the moon again, and we don't have that much we can look back to the Apollo era to help guide us now, because, so much has changed. So is laying off indiscriminately lots and lots of people who are tasked with making the agency, do some of its most ambitious programs ever? as we're trying to figure out to do them. Will that help? I think probably not. And again, maybe there are arguments for that, but we have not seen those being made.
Right. So there's precedent for layoffs like this to happen, but I think we're seeing them play out in an unprecedented way. And especially at a time when we're, like you said, ramping up another
been
program.
like a strategic or external reason. And I think what we're seeing now is that there's no, I mean, again, it depends on, people can argue about what the proper size of the federal workforce should be. But the way that they're going about it right now is not a strategic implementation of any broader plan beyond just shrinking the workforce.
Right. And something that we haven't touched on yet is the DOGE of it all, the Department of Government Efficiency, that is, which is another tool that the Trump administration has been using to kind of get more oversight into some of these federal agencies. The role of Elon Musk, who's the CEO of SpaceX, is unclear when we're talking about the Department of Government Efficiency. Can you break down the potential here for a conflict of interest, given that SpaceX has received billions of dollars in NASA funding? They actually just got a contract over the weekend, the time we're recording this on Monday. What is the potential here for a conflict of interest?
Yeah, I mean, certainly SpaceX builds rockets and NASA needs rockets to launch things into space. It's, NASA basically has no independent launch capability of its own. And, that's been a policy of the United States for many years, to use industry to help, NASA and the Department of Defense launch its stuff into space. SpaceX has become, in a sense, already so dominant that the contract you mentioned over the week to launch Dreier, there's actually no other rockets available, right? Every other company has either been completely revamping their plans, has not launched a new rocket, or doesn't have the, capability to lift something of an even medium size. As we're recording this, and for the past 2 years, SpaceX has kind of quietly had a monopoly on launch, not just in the United States, but even in Europe. Europe is currently paying SpaceX to launch its things into space. So the disruptive consequences of SpaceX have been massive. So there's, in a sense, yes, there's certainly, Elon Musk's business require a lot of NASA contracts, DoD contracts. There's certainly an opportunity and conflict of interest. Ideally, those types of conflicts can be managed by transparency and openness. Obviously, we haven't seen a lot of that. And it's more, I think, of how you see the agency moving forward in terms of larger programmatic things, right? Again, SpaceX, there's no other options for NASA right now to not launch things on SpaceX rockets, because there's just no other rockets ready to go. Now, where do we go in terms of, I think the bigger question is, does NASA reorient its overall human exploration program towards what Elon Musk has been talking about? And do we abandon these other initiatives in order to do that? That becomes, I think, an area of greater concern. Going to Mars is not an unusual goal of NASA. They've talked about it in the past, but it's, again, how do we do it? And then does it become a pure pass-through vehicle to his companies? That becomes more concerning. So again, ideally, there's always going to be some level of conflict of interest. It's about disclosure and managing those. And one would hope, and what we'd like to see is very open and firewalls put together, between these types of decisions. I would say so far, we're not seeing necessarily any consequences yet. But again, we're recording this 1 month into the new administration, and we don't know exactly where NASA is going or if they're going to change. And
speaking of where NASA is going, we talked about some of the leadership shakeups that have happened recently. There's another one that we're expecting very soon, and that's Jared Isaacman, who is Trump's nominee to be the permanent NASA administrator. Jared Isaacman is a SpaceX ally. He's arguably their largest private customer. He's flown to space twice with SpaceX on missions that he purchased from them. What kind of mindset could Isaacman bring to NASA, given his background and maybe some of his past comments on the Artemis program and the components of it?
Yeah, Jared Isaacman's a really unusual choice. He's an interesting choice. I'd say broadly among folks in the space community, I think the reaction was pleasant surprise. He has been to space, so he knows personally what the risks are and what it's like to not just to go, but to do something successfully. There's also the idea of his background, as you say, from private sector. He dropped out of high school and to found his company that's worth billions of dollars. Right? So he's been a very successful entrepreneur, In the ideal case, I think he brings an expectation of performance, an expectation of efficiency, and an expectation of delivering on program promises, and really carries that through to Artemis and other aspects of NASA where, we have not seen great performance in the last few years for a lot of components of the Artemis program. So I think that level of energy and desire to make those things work could be very positive for the organization. The risk, though, I mean, not even necessarily a risk. That I think the other aspect that's worth considering is that the NASA administrator is not called the NASA CEO for a reason, right? The NASA, they administrate a policy set by the White House, and they use the budget provided to them by the Congress. And so the amount of power the administrator has is not as broad as a lot of people would like to expect. You have to be very good at going to people and asking for money and arguing for your programs, and also to the White House to say, these are the policies I need. And we just don't know. Jared Isaacman, I think, has never been anything but a CEO. And so he's used to calling all the shots. This is a much more, in a sense, coalition building role to be in. Now, again, I think there's something else that's actually noteworthy about him is that he's politically, he's not very out there with his political beliefs, which in these days is, I think, rather refreshing. But also that if you look at his donation history, it's been broadly to Democrats. And so he's not coming in as a highly partisan individual, at least under this current political dynamic. And so he would be likely a Democrat or a moderate or an independent working for a Republican administration. And that could be very good for this broader sense of maintaining NASA as a nonpartisan organization, that you can have all sorts of political beliefs leading the agency, not because even it's a bipartisan stuff, but because it's irrelevant in terms of what they want to do there and what the role of NASA is. And so that can help him with nomination, going through nomination of getting Democratic support. It could help just kind of represent the space agency as not like an arm, not even of Donald Trump so much as even as Elon Musk, who's now very political. It has the opportunity to be just that, a symbol of itself, that NASA is still a unifying activity within a very highly partisan government environment right now. So I think that's a real promise and opportunity there.
Now, something that folks in space circles bring up when they talk about Isaacman is the Space Launch System. That is the NASA-built launch vehicle that is assigned to launch Artemis 2 and Artemis 3. Isaacman has called that SLS outrageously expensive, were his words that he used in a tweet a few months ago. We also just saw Boeing recently this month announce that they may be laying off members of their SLS team. That was a move that NASA headquarters reportedly was not aware of. We talked about the potential for the SLS to get scrapped about a month ago, and you said it was probably unlikely. Has your opinion changed?
A little. I'd say the range of outcomes we've seen now make me say it's more likely than I thought it was. But I'm still on the fence about it, frankly. And you've just recently seen the chair of the House Science Committee and of the Senate Appropriations Committee both say that we need to keep Artemis going, and we need to keep, they didn't say SLS necessarily by name, but they said we need to keep the momentum going. And, we had Congress in last September in the House, and then in December in the Senate, both released NASA policy bills that not just endorsed the ongoing continuation of the SLS, but framed it as a reaffirmation of the SLS. And the firings or the potential layoffs at Boeing, I think they're around 400, which the first time it would be far more than that if the SLS was actually cut. It'd be tens and tens of thousands. It's not impossible. And I think that's the key thing here. The way that we can frame this is, yes, SLS is not an efficient program. The way it has been managed has done nothing to change anyone's mind, and it reinforces all of the pitfalls of large classic kind of government contractor programs. It is not pushing new boundaries in technology. It's not reusable. It's very expensive. It clearly does not launch very often. There's a lot of political reasons why it exists. It's basically the way to continue the space shuttle era workforce that was set up in the 1970s and 80s. And, space politics since the end of Apollo has been dominated by the idea of local politics, parochial politics. Our jobs in my district. And if they are, I'm protecting that program. We may be at a turning point in the forces that dominate space politics. A lot of other aspects of our politics in this country have shifted from local issues to national issues, right? In terms of culture, symbolism, broad alignment, whose team am I on and so forth. That's a well-known trend. Space has largely bucked that trend, but I think what we're seeing now is the first real challenge to it. So if you're a senator from a state that has a large number of people working on the SLS, let's say for the case of this discussion, those would be Alabama, Florida, Texas, Utah, Mississippi. And those members of those, particularly the senators, there's the Republican senators, the members of the same party. And is it going to be more valuable for them politically to align with the leader of their party, who's very popular among their party right now? Or is it going to be more popular for them or better for their career if they support the jobs in their district and break with Donald Trump? And I think the question is actually very open. We don't know. Right? And we've seen so far a very little willingness to break with the alignment of their party leader. And so there could be a situation where if the White House proposes just to end the project, even though it has all of these local political needs and all these economic benefits to those states, they may not fight it because it may be more politically expedient and frankly better for their reelection prospects if they align with the president. So that could be the first real time changing how space is conceived of as a political system in the United States, again, in nearly 50 years. So that's why it's hard to, in a sense, model where this is going to go. Will that be a salient enough issue? So I frankly don't know at this point. It still seems like there's a lot of built-in support. I wouldn't dance on its grave yet if one is predisposed to do that, but it's certainly the biggest challenge this project will have had in its existence.
And speaking of the existence of the project, obviously, it would take a bit of political pressure to cancel the SLS and even more to cancel Artemis. But let's talk about that possibility, because Elon Musk has called the moon a distraction and said we should go straight to Mars. Donald Trump in his inaugural address did not mention the moon, but he did mention Mars. So there is some support, at least, potentially, for bypassing the moon and going to Mars. In your opinion, what would NASA be sacrificing by doing that?
I want to go to Mars. The Planetary Society wants to send humans to Mars. I just want to make that clear first. We should go to Mars. But if you abandon Artemis now to do, in a sense, a crash program, particularly one that is centered around as divisive now of an individual as Elon Musk, you lose a couple of things. You lose the support of your allies who have gone all in on Artemis, European Space Agency, Japanese Space Agency, United Arab Emirates, who's becoming a spacefaring nation, has been investing a lot, has a major contract on the Gateway space station. You say that to them that we promised you that we would be going to the moon to stay, and we changed our minds after 5 years under the same administration that proposed it, and we would abandon them. We would abandon the commercial partners who have built business cases with their investors around the idea that there will be long-term contracts and business opportunities for decades to come because the US is leading the way to the moon, and it will be staying there, and we will need to supply and provide communications and provide all these support opportunities and maybe develop new economies in space. You'd be abandoning them. You'd be ceding the moon to China, which is a geopolitical rival, which has its own very focused and very serious capabilities that are developing for going to the moon. And you'd allow China, in a sense, to assert the norms and behaviors of lunar activities on their own, because there'd be no other nation going with them or even there at the same time. And you'd be saying to the nation that, Artemis was designed very smartly to say that this is a national interest it's serving. It's national interest in terms of how it's intersecting with our partners, our allies, building up our private sector, and also being the symbol, right? It's the Trump administration, when it proposes that it will be sending the next man and the first woman to the moon, that it's meant to be this more ecumenical, broader, holistic approach, right? That these are going to be a fundamental change in how we go to space and think of the moon. And that's as serving a national interest. And that they understood when they designed this program that they wouldn't be the administration to carry it forward. You're thinking of yourself, space is big. It's hard to go into space. It takes time to do things in space. Every administration is taking a baton in a relay race from one administration working the space program, carrying it, and then handing it off to the next one. Going to Mars, you can only go once every 2 years. It takes 9 months to get there. You maybe have one shot at it in this administration. And if you leave and abandon this broadly accepted, broadly bought into, broad coalition that you formed around the moon to make a Hail Mary for Mars, which probably won't work, you will not have that buy-in when the next administration or the next person who's not Elon Musk or the next person who's not Donald Trump in the White House decides what do we do with our space program. And so it's that you don't abandon something that has had this much work put into it to make it a broad consensus. And if you want to go to Mars, you've got to make it the consensus, because again, we don't get the luxury to do things in a congressional or presidential term, 2 or 4 year cycles. Space is big, and orbital mechanics does not care what our electoral politics says. And so we need to be thinking about the long term. And we've encouraged, my organization has, that if we do want to go to Mars, and we want to, make the case and build that consensus. And I think we could make a real additive step in going in that direction. But I think to abandon the plans that we have put down that have been the most successful program to return humans to the moon, after Apollo, would be a mistake.
Right. So we do want to get to Mars one day, but we want to do it the right way. And I guess we'll see how everything plays out in the next few months. I think it'll be an interesting time to keep an eye on what's going on at NASA. Casey Dreier, thank you again for joining today.
My pleasure.